Business plunging is perhaps of the most perilous occupation on the planet, being caught under the heaviness of many feet of sea, is the pestering fear of each and every jumper as they are joined to the surface with a solitary lifesaver umbilical rope when the trustworthiness of this connection is in risk. The results are crushing. This is the lethal breakdown of the Wildrake jumping mishap. INF Fabco Plunging Administrations had recently gotten the agreement to fix an oil depot in the North Ocean. They were a business jumping activity which had just gained a pristine plunging transport. The Wildrake, the last subtleties, were all the while being seen to in assembling, so they would rush this boat out to begin their maintenance contract quickly. In this maintenance plan, the Infabco jumping organization would reinstall a riser and purchase in a filling station for an oil stage in the Thorn oil field. This filling station was known as a solitary anchor leg, mowing or sum, and it permitted big haulers to pull up at a protected separation from the stage to top off during this first gathering of plunges they needed to bargain with various unforeseen issues with the new immersion plunging framework. This framework incorporated a jumping chime to ship jumpers to the vital profundities to chip away at welding, fitting and fixing the SOM parts. This ringer would be compressed to match the strain on the outside, so the two jumpers could work and rest in shifts somewhere down in the sea. The Wildrake was outfitted with an immersion plunging framework. This permitted the jumpers who were working many feet beneath the surface to remain under tension inside the boat to keep away from the long decompression plan for sporting plunging. A jumper could burn through 10 minutes at a more profound profundity, then have a sluggish rising with stops at a few profundities en route to permit the gas that was driven into the circulatory system an opportunity to gradually gas off, staying away from the perilous results of decompression affliction. Assuming that you return to shallow profundities excessively fast, the gas leaves the circulation system out of nowhere and causes air bubbles which are agonizing and crippling, and in outrageous conditions can be lethal. Business jumpers need to spend long time spans at profound profundities to finish work projects, which is risky for organizations attempting to do fixes or establishments on the ocean bottom. The immersion plunging framework is a smart answer for keep the jumpers securely at a reliable measure of strain for broadened time frames. For this situation, the jumpers would be under immersion for 28 days all at once. This would permit them to work in movements to finish the contracted fixes while staying away from the sluggish 5-day cycle of decompression on the Wildrake. The plunging ringer was joined to two living chambers. This permitted 6 jumpers to be in immersion simultaneously. 2 jumpers would go down in the ringer to chip away at the specific employment, while the other 4 would eat rest, and rest. The quarters were confined, however the work paid well, so jumpers were ready to forfeit their solace. What's more, risk their security to help their families back home. There was a group committed to checking the air quality, temperature and strain of the immersion chambers, and one more group devoted to the chime. The men were all confronting a similar risk in such a high press climate, yet the folks in the chime confronted extra dangers by being distant from everyone else, almost 500 FD underneath the surface. The Wildrake had been dealing with the task for almost a month. They had effectively finished 29 ringer plunges dealing with different pieces of the association and establishment. The 6 men presently under immersion on the Wildrake in August of 1979 had just barely begun their 28-day plan. Richard Walker, Skip Gould, and Dave Mitchell, Roger Palmer, and Dave Boyd were on the 10th day of immersion. They had moved the finished HIM unit close to the Thorn stage and were going to append it to the SOM base. When the pass group emerged from immersion, they imparted a portion of their issues to the spick and span chamber and chimed their 17 plunges with a first for this fresh out-of-the-box new boat. So they found a few issues to oversee and slip-ups to fix. One of the primary revelations was that the chime couldn't be lifted up into its support. To be sent off the turn connector was excessively lengthy for the support that was on this boat. it appears to be a principal plan. Standard that was missed. However, Brian Masterson, the proprietor of Infab, chose to pull the turn off the lift wire and reconnect it with 2 shackles. Rather, it tackled the fit issue, yet was an unfortunate substitute for the fundamental turn activity. The force and effect on the shackles was not suitable. However, it was a transitory answer for this plunge trip, despite the fact that there were some problematic plan highlights for this belt. The new gathering entered immersion with certainty that their groups on the boat would guard them. So on this day, August 7th, Richard and Skip were up for their chime shift. It was 11:00 p.m. What's more, the men were prepared in their serious trouble suits to enter the ringer. These suits were a fundamental part of immersion. Jumping one of the many cylinders took care of through the umbilical line to the chime contained heated water. The water courses through their scuba suits to keep them warm. The temperature in the North Ocean was 40 degrees F. The umbilical additionally had cylinders to give their breathing gas blend and power, as well as strings for profundity measures, correspondences, and Vido. The chime was intended to be fixed with a 2-fold entryway framework that would permit the tension inside to be raised or brought down to match the profundity where the work would be played out. This strain would likewise permit the portalways to be opened without flooding the inside with water. One of the 2 men would bring down themselves into the water and become the lockout man, playing out the work outside the chime. The other man would stay inside as the bellman to screen CO2 levels, gaseous tension correspondences, and the umbilical of the external man. At 11:40, Richard slipped into the dull water to begin the night's work. He performed large numbers of his errands and was presently utilizing a camcorder to show the base to the plunge director. Up on the boat, after a couple of passes with the camera, he went to get back to the chime. What he saw was mistaking briefly. However, at that point, it turned out to be strikingly clear. The chime was a lot nearer to the ocean bottom and was hanging at a 45 point. He guided his camera to the ringer to show the outdoors group as he quickly moved to the ringer, realizing that he needed to get inside. Previously, it drew any nearer to the base. In one of the uncommon plan defects of this chime, there was no edge to hold the ringer off the sandy base. In the event that it should have been put down, the ringer would straightforwardly lay on the ground, with next to no space to work the trapdoor entryway. As Richard moved to the chime, Skip was inside airing out the gas valve to expand the tension inside the ringer. Since the whole chime had dropped 25 ft, the cold water was beginning to ascend the storage compartment. It was 2:45 a.m. At the point when Richard educated the topside regarding what he saw, the lift wire was not generally associated with the chime. He came up the storage compartment and pulled the inward entryway shut as he and Avoid attempted to sort out precisely exact thing had occurred up in the boat. The ringer group understood that the lift wire had broken and the chime was really hanging by its umbilical. The video screen had gone dark back and no correspondences were coming from the ringer. Out at hand, another gigantic issue was uncovered. High temp water was regurgitating all around the deck from the umbilical. This was another plan imperfection that had been uncovered half a month sooner when the high temp water line broke inside the umbilical. Some unacceptable sort of tubing was utilized and it immediately sheared under the crimping and collapsing of the umbilical. This issue had been tackled by adding another heated water line outside the umbilical and simply taping it set up around the current line. When the lift wire broke, the moment pull on the umbilical caused a split. The difference in this outer tubing, so presently they were without correspondences and a reducing supply of boiling water, yet the gas line and profundity measures actually appeared to be working appropriately. The chime group could see that the inner tension of the ringer had expanded, demonstrating that the folks were both inside and they had expanded the strain to seal the entryway shut. For the present, this was to some degree, stable circumstance. The air supply was great, and they likewise had crisis air tanks connected to the chime. Typically, in this present circumstance, a plunging boat would establishment its optional ringer recuperation strategy to jump monetarily, ships were expected to have an essential and optional method for chime recuperation, set up in one more decimating blemish of plan. The optional strategy must be debilitated only weeks before the boat was intended for the ringer to be sent off through a moon pool on the deck surface. Sadly, their originators weren't knowledgeable about the harsh North Ocean, nor the ordinary traps of letting a ringer fall down a pool in the deck. Due to the tempest they had been confronting, the chime must be dropped into the water over the side of the boat. There was a decent crane framework called a davit that could swing out over the water to send off the chime that way. Tragically, when the cluster weight was dangling from the base, it couldn't prepare for battle railing. The bunch weight was the legitimate ringer sending off component, yet it likewise filled in as a crisis recuperation framework. In the event that the lift wire broke, this framework incorporated a significant burden brought down on 2 aid wires. Once this weight hit the seabed, the ringer could be brought down to the legitimate profundity. On the rules, this made for a steady way for the chime without a lift wire. The cluster weight could be pulled back up by its aid wires, and the chime recuperated in a genuinely normal way. The choice was made to simply eliminate the bunch weight framework to clear the rail and send off the ringer into the water. They had been involving this technique for quite a long time. In any case, put forth no attempts to redress what is going on now. That Richard and Skip were securely in the ringer with no lift wire or cluster standby to bring them up. Choices were being examined on the most proficient method to recuperate the chime securely back in the ringer. The men were following convention. They were secured in the chime, however had no correspondences with the surface. They kept on attempting to send messages, yet just heard static over the radio. The air and heated water were all the while streaming, so they simply had to hold on and trust that a recuperation activity will recover them. Out of nowhere, they felt a yanking hurl, and afterward, one more. They were in finished mistrust, yet clearly that they were attempting to recuperate the chime, utilizing their most valuable help. Skirt shouted into the comms, "Put us on the base, over and over." He had no clue, assuming it was traversing, except for he was frantic to safeguard the main association that was keeping them alive on the Wildrake. The jumping administrator, Holmes, was under enormous strain to sort out how to recuperate the chime. He was well mindful that the cluster weight was not in help, so they would need to depend on the main other technique accessible to him, the umbilical. There were some chime frameworks where the umbilical could be utilized as a crisis recuperation strategy. However, the Wildrake was not really one of them. The organization that had fabricated this boat had missed a few significant insights regarding immersion plunging ringer development and limits in the working circumstances. Depending on their case, that the umbilical water power could deal with the heap was not consoling. They had produced an umbilical that had proactively fizzled with ill-advised materials, so this was a dangerous decision. The proprietor of Infab, Brian Masterson, was with Holmes as they counseled the most experienced jump tasks men to examine options. The most secure decision would have been to bring down the men to the seabed to ease the strain on the umbilical, then demand one more boat to send their ringer jumpers down to reattach a lift wire to the highest point of the Wildrake chime. At 2:57 in the first part of the day, they contacted the closest plunge transport, the Stena. Welder, they just expressed that they had an issue and to back up for potential help. Distance. Eventually, they chose to attempt the umbilical first, regardless of having one more sensible arrangement proposed. During this time, the men on deck were attempting to fix the high-temp water line to restrict the sum that was being lost. This work was halted when they got the request to start up the pressure-driven engine on the umbilical wheel. They were shocked by the solicitation, yet were in no situation to firmly challenge the proprietor and jump administrator. The umbilical began pulling. Furthermore, folding over the wheel, yet in minutes the stop request was given. The men were in finished doubt. The umbilical was dividing open and the singular wires and cylinders were currently stuck in the side of the wheel. They were profoundly stuck, and high-temp water was presently regurgitating from this meat processor. This ought to have been an ideal opportunity to bring in help and trust that the lift wire could be reconnected by the Stainer welder group. However, that is not what Masterson and Holmes concluded. They were as yet expectation on utilizing the umbilical to recuperate the ringer. The Wildrake had a crane at hand, and they planned to utilize it. They rehashed the work to pull the umbilical to lift the chime up to the boat. When they began, they were fallen into ruin once more. The umbilical was not just parting separated. The cylinders and wires were in a real sense snapping and popping separated during this pivotal second. A weak transmission could be heard coming from the chime. The voice stressed mentioning the ringer be set on the seabed skip had at last been heard inside the chime. Skip and Richard were stunned that the ringer had been yanked around by its umbilical. However, when the move development halted, they realized that something awful had happened. The lights had gone out, so they turned on the crisis battery ability to check out their circumstance. Plainly their umbel had been harmed. Just 2 lines endure the injury. The primary gas and the outdoors interior profundity. It was presently 3:45 a.m. Also, the clock had formally begun ticking. Their boiling water line had been cut off, and their most major problem would be hypothermia. They followed systems and opened their endurance suits, which ended up being foil covers, and on second thought of the full body suits they expected at 4. The Stainer welder was at last requested to make the salvage. The 2 boats went this way and that with directions and hardware. However, by 5:45, the issues were settled. 2 Stainer welder jumpers, Eddie Forthright and Phil Casey, were going to associate the wire and connect with Skip and Richard. Initially, the welder bunch wanted to lift the actual ringer to assist with working with the exchange, yet Brian were straight over the ringer area for the most secure lift point, and the Wildrake would need to pull in the chime at a 45 point, which is totally unbelievable in business. Plunging it conflicted with every single best practice. However, Masterson wasn't a jumper, he was a finance manager. His building botches appeared to go on without anybody ready to actually. The welder's chime was down at the objective region, however needed to look around for over an hour to try and find the ringer. When the Wildrake team gave the directions, they failed to remember that they had moved the chime away from the song base hours sooner, yet neglected to refresh the area. Organizers, this probably won't have been an issue in the event that the ringer transponder had been set up as it had been for the past 29 chime plunges the very night before, when Skip and Richard were being brought down into the North Ocean. The transponder came free from an external perspective of the ringer, as opposed to pulling the chime back and appropriately connecting the area gadget. The deckhands were told to simply remove it. They were in a rush to get the ringer in the water after many defers. Now that they are in this desperate circumstance, where consistently matters, this exercise in futility was unbelievable. Wrong. Organizes no transponder for finding. It was passed on to straight to the point, and Casey to stroll in a wide arc around their chime to view as the lost men. In a horrible, unfortunate turn of events, the Stainer welder was fixing their ringer not long before the solicitation for help was made, so the lights outside their chime didn't work, and the comms from jumper to ringer were likewise out. This made the whole effort very unwieldy and perilous for these men. At 6:44 a.m. Casey entered the water to begin the pursuit, and over an hour after the fact, he at last connected with the chime. He tapped on the window with his blade handle and was feeling better to see the frenzied development inside. He saw a face and 2 approval in the port. Opening it was 7:55, and they were affirmed to be perfectly healthy during this search period. Richard and Skip had no clue about what was happening. They had been sitting tight without correspondences for more than 3 hours subsequent to going through the choices they chosen to turn to the last crisis activity accessible to them beyond each ringer. there are drop loads appended to overload the chime in light of its normal lightness as an air bubble in a crisis circumstance. These drop loads can be delivered to permit the ringer to make a fast rising to the surface. For recuperation, the key variable that makes this recuperation conceivable is that the two men should be locked inside the chime under controlled pressure. Any other way, this speedy climb would be sure demise. There had as of late been a few passing, due to unplanned arrival of drop loads. On the off chance that one man was outside the chime working, he would be hauled to the top in a grisly unavoidable demise. These new occasions were new on the personalities of the Wildrake group. Only weeks before they had been coordinated to add nylon ropes to tie the drop loads to the beyond the ringer to stay away from inadvertent delivery. The issue with this is that jumpers would have to go external the chime to cut the ropes before they could enact the delivery system skip, and Richard knew about this unconventional framework and realized that one of them would need to go out to cut the ropes before they were excessively hypothermic. To make the jump, there was one wrecking snag. They were perched on the seabed with no real way to get out. There was a slight slant to the chime, so the storage compartment was not totally flush with the sandy base. Richard had the option to reshape his body to stretch around the opening with his blade. His arm was cut up from the strain against the sharp metal edges, yet he had the option to free one of the two loads. The opposite side was an inconceivable assignment. He was not ready to arrive at the ropes for the second weight in light of the slant of the chime, and the relies on the external entryway. This was the last choice inside their control, and presently they were confronted with an obscure weight for salvage. The outdoors meters recorded that the ringer was repressurized, and drop weight discharges were opened somewhere in the range of 710 and 750. They had quite recently locked the lid and resealed the entryway when Phil Casey thumped on the port opening. The men probably had a flood with the expectation that they were found, and help was right external the ringer. It had been 4 hours since they lost their intensity, so hypothermia was setting in. They crouched together to attempt to decrease the wild shudder and trust that heroes will get them out. Finding the chime was the perfect initial phase in a troublesome system. For Casey to perform, he needed to bring the lift wire to the ringer and get things appropriately got in a dim sea in isolation. The chime lights and his comms weren't working in this manner. Many excursions must be made back to the chime to speak with the surface. The steno welder above was being hurled around by the sea waves, which made the ringer direction and area continually changing. Casey needed to begin another each excursion to sort out what course the Sombase and Wildrake chime were found. The trouble of his undertaking can't be put into words, and he was almost hypothermic himself attempting to save these two individual jumpers. At 902, he kept an eye on the jumpers through the port opening. They were making exceptionally unhinged hand developments, and he could see their total urgency to be saved. After a few additional outings to and fro, the lift wire was at last associated. It was 1010 when Casey looked again at the men and was feeling much better that they were, as a matter of fact, still alive and alert. It had been more than 7 hours since the wire broke, and no less than 5 hours without heated water. The men were unquestionably hypothermic, however, holding tight to trust. After a few additional hiccups, the ringer was at long last associated with the Wildrake, and they were prepared to recuperate this chime and save the men. It was 11:40 when the Vixen began turning. However, inside only minutes, another overwhelming error would obliterate the shaky association. Masterson's decision to drag the chime at a 45 point rather than simply moving the Wildrake straightforwardly above would cost them everything. As the ringer started getting across the seabed, it got hung up, yet Masterson advised the crane administrator to shake the crane this way and that, and full hurl on. Their most horrendously terrible feelings of trepidation were affirmed when a boisterous blast and snap of the line made it go leeway. It was 12:20, and the ringer was lost again inside the chime. Richard and Skirt probably known precisely exact thing happened. It had been 8 hours since The chime had lost intensity, and 2 hours since. Somebody had last looked through their window. They heard the metal bang of the wire being connected, and presently the chime was at long last moving. The mind-boggling help probably resuscitated their expectations for salvage. However, at that point, the unbelievable and noisy conflict of metal carried the ringer to a sudden stop, and afterward, after a second, the bang of the wire breaking and the arrival of the chime back to the seabed, Richard and Skip were hypothermic depleted and approaching demise. Every breath was a task to maneuver the virus air into their lungs. Their men realized that it had required long periods of freezing quietness, trusting that that wire will be reattached. The initial time, the sinking acknowledgement that they just may not make due for enough time to get the ringer out of the water, was pulverizing. The steno welder was inquired again to find the ringer and check what had happened. Honest endured 30 minutes looking. Lastly, found the Wildrake's chime wedged firmly between a line and the som base at one. He tapped on the port opening and saw the white essence of Richard respond. He was drawing hard breaths. What's more, gradually woke him up to see the face looking in at him. Skip was nestled into his sweeping on the floor of the ringer. Similarly, as straight to the point had moved a look. He was yanked away by his umbilical. The difficult situations kept the ST, a more out of control battling to remain in place. This moved their chime. What's more, pulled the jumpers wildly at 3-0. The steno. More stunning jumpers were raised to the surface. Following 9 hours in the water, another jumper was sent down to attempt to rehook the lift wire and get the Wildrake men out of the water. It was 5-0 when he found the chime here. Peered inside, kicked the bucket to find the men slouched over one another on the floor. Skip and Richard had been without high-temp water for more than 13 hours. It was only after 7:30 that the ringer was at long last recuperated and welcomed on board the Wildrake, regardless of 12 individual brave endeavors to save the men. It wouldn't be. They had made do with no boiling water for no less than 9 hours. This was an unfathomable accomplishment of the human will to make do. As this occasion was examined throughout the following quite a while, the numerous careless and imprudent decisions were addressed by the proficient plunging local area. Brian Masterson shouldn't have coordinated the salvage. There were some very capable men who realized the dangers well and had plans laid out to recover an isolated chime. His errors, compounded with others, cost these two men their lives. To compound an already painful situation, he was attempting to get the umbilical supplanted so he could send the immersed jumpers down to follow through with the task. The 4 men that stayed in immersion promptly requested to begin the decompression cycle, which was take them 5 days at last. The organization was sued in Scottish and US courts, yet they had the option to dodge any genuine outcomes of these activities by guaranteeing that they were not the real manager of the men. Later, in a UK court, 12 people were sued and settled with the jumpers' families for a little monetary payout.